Hello and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we take a look at today's news, views, trends, and opinions from a decidedly conservative perspective. I'm your host, Shane Patrick Connolly, and with me today is Father Robert Sirico, president of the Acton Institute. Welcome, Father Sirico.
Great being with you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Perhaps we can start by having you tell us a little bit about the work of the Acton Institute and your role there.
Sure. Well, about 30 years ago, a colleague of mine and myself founded the Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan, named after Lord Acton, who said, "Power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely." We founded it as an educational institute to help religious thinkers and also business leaders consider the moral potential of a free market economy. You know, we'll have lots of time, I hope, to talk about what that means. But especially at the time that we began the Institute, I had been in seminary and seen the favoritism that was shown to various left-wing movements at that time called liberation theology. It was the attempt to baptize Karl Marx, basically. And I thought, we can do better than that. So we founded an institute that educates seminarians, religious leaders across the board. We call them the formers of the moral consensus, the people who go into making the moral consensus about what the good is in society. That, of course, would include business people as well. And so we began it 30 years ago, and today it is good-size operation. We're one of the highest-ranked think tanks in the country and in the world. We won the Charity Navigators Prize for one of the best-run nonprofits in the country. I think there were 300 501c3 nonprofits. So we try to practice what we preach, good business that has an ethical base.
Well, that's fantastic. It sounds like it's a great organization. And how many people have you educated over the years in the business and religious sectors of our society?
It'd be hard to say. Thousands upon thousands, really, especially now with the internet, which didn't exist when we first began. Thank you, Al Gore. So we have a large conference every year with 1,000 people from all over the world, about 60, 70, 80 countries. We have various smaller conferences. We have a large, robust publications program. And also we've been doing various documentaries and media output that way. We have a blog, and we have what do you call it when you do a podcast? That's it. And I show my age. I'm also the oldest person on staff at the Acton Institute, I should say. We have about 45, 50 people who work at our office in Grand Rapids. We have an office in Rome and an affiliate in Buenos Aires in Argentina as well.
Now, by training, you are a Catholic priest, correct?
I am a Catholic priest.
But the Acton Institute, is that a Catholic organization?
No,
or
emphatically not. It's ecumenical from day one. The problem I saw in the Catholic Church exists in a lot of religious traditions and religious institutions. So I like to joke and say we have everything from Mormons to Muslims who participate in our programs. Of course, the majority are Roman Catholics and evangelical Protestants, mainline Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and we have a contingent of Muslims and Jews as well who are involved. It's a really interesting mix because it's not an ecumenical effort in its intent. That is, we don't do it for ecumenical dialogue, but in fact, it's one of the most diverse programs anyone would ever attend, next to, walking out a street in Brooklyn, which is where I grew up.
So speaking of where you grew up, how did you end up in the priesthood? I know you have a fairly famous older brother, I've heard.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about how you ended up in the priesthood and he ended up in Hollywood.
Well, both of our lives are very circumlocuted, but they began in Brooklyn with a lot of diversity. But I, in my teens and in my early 20s, drifted from the church. ended up being involved in left-wing politics. Some of it, by the way, here in California. I'm a graduate of University of Southern California. And then someone gave me some books to read on economics, and it precipitated two, I guess you could call them conversions. The first conversion was a change in the way I viewed the structure of society, the right to private property, free enterprise, and things like that. But the second conversion was when I came back to my faith that I had abandoned, I think by then about 13 years prior. My brother grew up in New York, had trouble with the police growing up. He was just a very tough kid. Ended up, and this is public, so I'll say it, ended up in prison. And in prison, he saw some acting troops. And he said, you know, maybe it's better if I act. And
Good
so
choice.
he got out, and he has done probably over 40 movies. He was in Godfather 2, I think it was, just a very bit part. Most of his stuff ended up on the floor. He's done more movies for Woody Allen than anyone except Diane Keaton. And of course, his most famous part was as Paulie Walnuts in The Sopranos. And he made it to the end.
Excellent. That is a rare thing in The Sopranos, I understand. So
It was.
very good. Well, that's certainly an interesting background and a diverse background, to be sure. And I guess you've brought your perspective to your role at the Acton Institute.
Yes.
And work with a wide variety of people, as you described. Now, what underpins the philosophy at the Acton Institute and your support of our free market economy?
The way we look at economics, this is very strange, a priest talking about economics, religious leaders talking about economics, and yet we do it all the time. Anytime we talk about the poor and the obligations that we have as moral beings to the poor, we're talking about some dimension of economics. The problem is that those good intentions are very often not informed by sound economics. And what we want to do is provide that sound economic basis. And our approach to economy is not mathematical or abstractions or statistics, which is what people usually think of when they think of economics, but what the most fundamental thing that economics is about, and that is human action. Decisions that people make to better themselves and their lives and the lives of their families and the lives of communities. And so we ask, the first question is, who is the human person? What constitutes the human reality? And we find that the most obvious thing about us is our physicality, so that has to be taken into account. But the other thing about us is our transcendent capacity, our ability to rise above the material. I would call that spiritual reality. People who have different traditions name it in different ways. And so it's the bringing together of this physical or corporeal and transcendent or spiritual, or to put another way, heaven and earth, bringing together heaven and earth. And that's why we talk about religion and liberty, or freedom and virtue, or freedom and truth. And I think that a free economy represents the most natural way in which people interact with the material world and then form institutions to protect that productivity, that freedom, that liberty, the bringing of their intelligence to bear on the natural physical world. I think that other systems, to a lesser or greater extent, tend to coerce people, force people, make the decisions based on the decisions of groups of people, politburos or bureaucracies. And so what we want to do in a variety of different ways and through the lens of many different religious traditions and ethical traditions is to consider how a free economy rooted in private property, the rule of law, a juridical framework, can best serve the human community.
Now, conservatives would say that we've had a very successful manifestation of that here in the United States in our system of government. However, it's come in for a lot of criticism of late. I think it being labeled rapacious capitalism by people on the left. And there are religious people on the left who criticize the excesses of capitalism today. What is the response to that, or the antidote to that, perhaps?
Well, I think my first reaction to that is to say, there's a lot of truth in that. If people are greedy, if they exploit other people, if they manipulate the system to benefit themselves at the expense of other people, then all of that is to be identified and denounced on a moral level. I think that is deleterious to the good of society as a whole. That's not what I'm talking about when I talk about a free economy. When I'm talking about a free economy, I'm talking about human beings being able to discover and invent things, mechanisms, or processes, or products that come from nature and place them at the disposal of the human community. A great example of that here in Silicon Valley is sand. The most ubiquitous thing on the planet has now been transformed into the means by which we communicate with one another. That was done with oil, which was, for most of human history, had no value, or if it had any value, it was messy, Right. But because of the invention of the combustion engine, it was transformed into energy. And I think the free economy allows that inventiveness to happen when it has certain institutions that protect it. It is the antithesis of rapacious. Certain people can use their liberty to harm other people. You can say they are rapacious. The thug in the back alley is a rapacious person. But that doesn't have any, he's using his liberty. But does that make liberty wrong? Well, liberty is a choice between right and wrong. So that is true. People can act in a free economy in an immoral and in a harmful way. Does that mean that the solution is to have other people make decisions for people? Well, now if you want to talk about rapacious, let's talk about rapacious with a capital R and on stilts, because you have many, many examples, even in the last century and a half, of rapacious economic systems, all of which fall under the rubric of some form of collectivism or socialism or communism or managed economy.
Very true. And is there a Catholic economics basis for the economy specifically?
There are principles in Catholicism that are social principles. And I think there's a whole layer of prudential application of those principles. So the Church, and the Church says this officially in the Catechism and in the authoritative documents, the Church says that it has no economic model to propose. What it has is a view of the human person and the dignity of the human person. And it also, I think, pertaining to this question of economics and social organization, has a principle that's called the principle of subsidiarity, which I'll try to sum up in a bumper sticker. Subsidiarity basically says that needs are best met at the most local level of their existence. So if you have a need in your life, you have the first responsibility to fulfill that need. If there's a failure in your life, you're sick or can't do it, then your family moves in, then your extended family, then your neighbors, then your friends, then your church, then mediating institutions like maybe the Salvation Army or some other group. And only when there are failures at this lower level ought we to go up to a higher level. Now that is a Catholic principle. You find it, by the way, also in Protestantism. It's called sphere sovereignty. It's a form of subsidiarity. You find it in the secular world. I mean, the founding fathers called this federalism, or a version of this, federalism, that let people do what they can do for themselves. So in that sense, I think there's a comfortable fit between a free economy, rightly understood, and Catholic religious principles and other religious principles in that sense. But that's not to say there's a dogmatic system that says Adam Smith or Ludwig von Mises or Friedrich Hayek are canonical texts that we have to believe at all times and in all places. No.
Okay. Well, there are criticisms that have come also from the Pope himself, the current leader of Catholics worldwide. And he comes from a certain tradition, I suppose,
Yes.
within the church. Are his criticisms on the mark, or how are we to view those?
Well, the way I put it, and let me first make a distinction that's very important because a lot of people don't seem to understand this. Your senator, your previous senator, Boxer, I had to testify before the Senate, and she made this mistake. She thought everything the Pope says, I'm bound to believe in. Well, if the Pope says tomorrow it's going to be beautiful, I'm not bound to believe that. I may think it's going to rain tomorrow because my arthritis is telling me it's going to rain tomorrow. The Pope can speak authoritatively only on matters of faith and morals, not on matters of science, not on matters of weather or aesthetics or economics. The church has no economic system. Now, he can make prudential critiques and say it does this or it has done that. And those are as good or as bad as the data and the empirical evidence that he has. With regard to Pope Francis, Jorge Bergoglio from Argentina, I understand the system that he saw there. I understand the kind of business people that he was acquainted with in Argentina. These were crony capitalists. These are not capitalists in the sense of, and I don't like the word capitalism because it's a Marxist word, by the way, and it overemphasizes capital. I'm talking about a free flow of ideas and actions and people and values when I describe a free society and a free economy. The Pope said to his biographer, told the story of growing up in a home where his father was an accountant, and he said, I have never liked economics. I have an allergy to economics. He doesn't understand economics. He said that, and I agree with him. From what I have seen, generally his pronouncement on economics don't betray a deep understanding. He has a deep compassion for the poor, but not a deep understanding about how you make food and housing and clothing and medical care to tend to the needs of those who go without. And so it's frustrating at times when I see him say or hear or read his writings on economics, and I think, gee, I wish I had 5 minutes with him to kind of clear up some of these things, because our fundamental values are the same. That is the dignity of the poor and the protection of the vulnerable.
Yes. And in that vein, we take the example maybe of Venezuela. If we look at the United States and our application of these free market principles and the moral underpinnings that our country kind of grew up with, are they translatable to South and Central America? How do the people of Venezuela improve their situation? How do we get this message to them? Kind of?
Well, it's difficult to get any message to Venezuela right now when they don't have electricity that's reliable, when they have their internet sources or their telephonic communications being monitored by a dictatorial government that exists down there. I think the founding of the United States, in many respects, was a discovery of truths, not an invention of truths. It was an assemblage of people who had read deeply in philosophy, in history, and based on the natural law. They had read the classics, and they brought together this experiment that we call the United States, this experiment in liberty. I don't want to let the United States off the hook, because in many ways we have betrayed that heritage, because a lot of what we call the American idea of economy has been manipulated by these crony capitalists. In fact, the very word lobbying, when I refer to crony capitalism, I'm talking about the people who lobby government to favor their particular business or hinder their competition. The very name lobbyist comes from a hotel in Washington, D.C., a stone's throw from the White House, where these people who had business interests would gather in the lobby of that hotel, wait for the politicians to come downstairs and pull them over to the side and say, look, I'm producing whiskey, and it's 10 years old, this whiskey. It's very good whiskey, and you really shouldn't allow that guy over there to produce whiskey because he's only been in business 3 years. So let's have a quality check on the whiskey that we produce in the United States. And this is the way it goes in all of the different industries. And now you can move out of that lobby in that hotel and look at Washington, D.C., which was the only place in the country where property values went up during the great crash of 2008 because of the lobbyists and because of the growth of government. And I think that's a betrayal. And that's not the ideal that I want to project to Venezuela, because that's what they have in Venezuela right now, but to a greater extent. I think it is a shame that what is happening in Venezuela is happening to a country that owns the greatest oil reserves in the world. It's incredible to believe that they have 1,000,000% inflation, that they have people digging out of garbage trucks to be able to live. I've seen the video of people literally taking food out of garbage trucks to eat. And it's because of this failed experiment of socialism. We have seen the same thing in North Korea. We've seen the same thing in China, to the extent that China took its socialism seriously. Now they don't anymore. We've seen the same thing in Cuba and throughout Eastern Europe, and anywhere that central planning attempts to control the economy, always, of course, for the poor. And that's what happens. Again, we go back to the word rapacious.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the United States, our government just seems on a trajectory of growth almost constantly, regardless of whether Republicans or Democrats are in the White House. What are we to do about our own country? As you said, these lobbyists, their power increases as the power of central government increases. Is there hope for the United States?
What worries me is just the image that you have outlined there. I think there are a lot of people, especially young people today, who have grown up with this prosperity and who just kind of assume that this is the way the world is and always has been. Mm-hmm. But it's not the case. In point of fact, we've hit the lotto. We are living at the richest moment of all of human history in the place where it's happening. And this cannot be sustained if we don't go back to understanding how this came to be. I think we have a moral obligation, first and foremost, to understand the basis of our freedom. What made this experiment in liberty and prosperity? How is it that we live in the most prosperous and liberal of all societies in all of human history? How is this? If I have a moment, there's an image that comes to my mind that I've told in many speeches across the country. And that is, I lived in a house that had a big tree going up way above the 3 stories of the house itself. And I noticed at the top of the tree that part of it was in bloom and part of it was dying. Now, I'm from Brooklyn. What do I know from trees, right? We had one in Brooklyn once, but they got it. So I called and found that there was a profession called a tree doctor. Who knew? And the tree doctor came and he examined the tree. He looked at the leaves. He looked at the bark. He looked at the roots. He came back and he said, "The tree is dead." I said, "How can the tree be dead? I see it blooming." He said, "It's an illusion." He said, what's happening is the sap is working its way through the trunk of the tree into the branches. But each year you're going to see less and less blossom, because once that's cut off, they're just living off of a past life that no longer exists. The roots are dead. I don't think the roots in the United States are dead. I think there are enough people who remember what brought about this freedom and this prosperity that goes with this freedom. And I think that's what we have to do. Understand that it's private property, it's the rule of law, it's a juridical framework, it's the respect for the individual toward another individual. It's what we call solidarity, the recognition of ourselves and other people. It's this fundamental belief that human beings possess a dignity that is not given to them by the government. And to clear up this confusion that somehow the socialist system is animated by a generosity and a concern for society and everything, I have no doubt that there are people who are doing that sincerely. But at the root of it is not generosity, it's envy. And the confusion was pointed out by no less a personage than Winston Churchill. He said, there's this confusion about Christianity and socialism. He said the socialism of the Christians said, everything that I have is yours. But the socialism of today says, everything that you have is mine. And that's what we have to clear up in the minds of especially this younger generation who are drifting towards socialism now.
So we have a couple minutes left, and I know that I've seen some encouraging signs from some youth visiting high schools, very excited about some of these free market principles. Where should they go to start getting an education about these principles so that they have a good, solid grounding so that they can be effective in delivering this message to their peers and to others?
Well, there's a plethora of organizations and periodicals that they could turn to, now websites. Let me make 3 concrete suggestions. The first is go online and Google a book called The Law by Friedrich Bastiat. It's a short book. It won't teach you what to think. It'll teach you how to think about looting and government and bureaucracy. Very short book. You have it read in an hour. The second is the story I Pencil. Leonard Read was the one who taught. It talks about how impossible it is for one person to make a pencil, how we need human cooperation through markets and prices. And the third thing is go to the Acton Institute website, acton.org. It is a veritable library of materials, including videos, short video clips. Watch the one, Mrs. Schneider. You'd enjoy that. It's a 10-minute clip, but very captivating. Lots of different research material, including really scholarly stuff, and then more popular stuff. We have blogs, we have podcasts, we have all kinds of things on that, acton.org.
All right. Well, thank you very much. You've been a great guest today, and I appreciate all of your work at the Acton Institute. Father Robert Sirico will be with the Liberty Forum this evening, and they meet on the second Tuesday of every month at the IFES Hall on 432 Sterling Road, Mountain View. In May, you can catch Mark Morano, prominent climate change skeptic, founder and executive director of ClimateDepot.com. And in June, Damian Schiff, senior attorney at the Pacific Legal Foundation. They focus on private property rights and especially environmental and land use issues. Thank you for joining us on The Right Side.